It is 7. Is everyone ready? Okay.
Yep.
Very good. Well, I'll call to order then this meeting of the Albany, California Planning and Zoning Commission for Wednesday, March 23rd, and it is 7 p.m. And for roll call, I will just note for the record that all the commissioners are present, and I will read the land acknowledgement. The City of Albany recognizes that we occupy the land originally protected by the Confederated Villages of Lijiang. We acknowledge the genocide that took place on these lands and must make strides to repay the moral debt that is owed to this indigenous people, specifically the Ohlone tribe. We thank them for their contributions, which have transformed our community and will continue to bring forth growth and unity. The City of Albany commits to sustaining ongoing relationships with the tribe and together build a better future for all that now make this their home. Okay, so we've completed items 1 and 2 on the agenda. Moving on to item 3, ex parte communications. Do any of the commissioners have any ex parte communications to disclose?
No.
None.
Okay, seeing shaking heads, we will move on to item 4, which is the consent calendar, which consists only of the minutes of the meeting of March 9th. Does anyone wish to pull the minutes for discussion or correction?
Nope.
If not, then would someone go ahead and move the minutes?
I'll move the consent calendar.
Second.
Thank you. We have a motion by Commissioner Donaldson, second by Commissioner Waddy, to move the consent calendar. And I'll call the roll myself. Commissioner Donaldson?
Yes.
Commissioner Waddy?
Yes.
Commissioner McLeod?
Yes.
Commissioner Moman?
Yes.
And myself vote yes as well, and that passes unanimously. On to announcements and communications. There are none in the agenda. Are there any others from staff or commissioners at this point?
Mr. Chair, I have just one quick one. I think I advised you in an email the other day, there is a commissioner and city council member training coming up this Friday at 11 a.m. put on by the Alameda Collaborative, which is an Association of Bay Area Governments sponsored consulting group. So if you have any questions about that, let me know. I think I sent you the link, and I believe it will be recorded, so that you're not able to attend at that point in time, there should be a recording available thereafter.
Thank you very much for keeping us well informed about that. Anything else? Seeing no other announcements, communications, we'll move on to public comment. This is for persons wishing to address the commission on any item that's not on the agenda. City policy limits each speaker up to 3 minutes. Please raise your hand, any members of the public who wish to speak on items not on the agenda. And I'm not seeing any raised hands. Going once, going twice, and we'll bring it back to the commission and continue on to item 7, discussion and possible actions of the following items: the City of Albany housing element work session. And I'll head over to staff for a presentation.
Yes, I'm going to bring up our consultant, Barry Miller, and as he's on his way up to the screen, I think everybody, the commissioners and members of the public know Barry, but just for the record, he's consultant with the city. He's prepared our previous housing elements, and our general plan is now under contract to prepare the current general plan. He's made a series of presentations to you in the past. We did have a good work study sessions with the city council on Monday evening that we're going to debrief on this Friday, and we'll be preparing for your a more formal report for you at a future meeting. But to summarize, I think it was really constructive. There were no major issues that I think would substantially change the direction of the work effort so far, but there was some good good feedback and good suggestions that we should respond to as we move forward. So with that, I'd like to just turn it right over to Barry for him to get started with a presentation of the new section. Thank you.
Great. Welcome back.
Thank you, and good evening, Commission. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can move through this PowerPoint. Okay, and if I could see at least one nodding head that everyone can see my screen. Okay, Jeff, thank you. So this is the fifth study session that we've convened on the housing element. We're moving through a series of topical study sessions, and just for background, we began with an introduction and orientation last year, walked you through the prior housing element and did an evaluation of how we're doing on implementing our policies and programs. We, in last fall, did a presentation of the needs assessment, which looks at demographic data and data on housing condition to provide an evaluation of what our housing needs are in the community. The last meeting, which was in January, and there was a follow-up discussion, I believe in early March, on housing sites, was to really talk about where in Albany housing can be constructed. And you will recall that the city is tasked with finding adequate sites for 1,114 housing units in an 8-year period from 2023 to 2031. We need to provide a buffer above and beyond that assignment of 1,114 units in case some of the sites that we identify fall off the list or become unavailable or are committed to non-housing uses during that 8-year period. So it's really more like 1,300 or 1,400 units that we're planning for, and that is a task that requires some rezoning. So what we are now doing is looking at constraints to housing development in the city. Again, the topics that you see on here are dictated by the government code. So we have a fairly prescriptive list of things that we have to do in order to get a certified housing element. After tonight's meeting, we'll be coming back to you for another study session to talk about fair housing issues. This is a new requirement that is part of the 6th cycle housing element that we're working on now. This is data on housing segregation in the community, on fair housing issues, and looking at ways that we can distribute our affordable and lower income housing more evenly across the city, and also address discrimination in housing and provide more inclusive housing policies. We'll be coming back after that meeting with the draft housing element that'll include policies and programs on top of the data that we've presented to you. There will be a city council meeting at that point, also on the policies and programs. At that point, we will be submitting a working draft of the housing element to the state, and that's we're looking now at July 2022 for that step. We will be then taking the state's comments this fall and incorporating them through some revisions and coming back to the Planning Commission with a revised draft at the end of the year. The deadline for adoption, which is the council action, is January 31st, 2023. So a little less than a year to complete this process now. So constraints, I mentioned, are a required part of the analysis under the government code, and the state recognizes 2 broad categories of constraints: governmental and non-governmental. And one way of thinking about this, or governmental constraints, are the things that the city of Albany has more control over, mostly our regulations, in particular our zoning standards. And the non-governmental constraints are things we have less control over, like the cost of lumber or the price of land or the availability of tax credits and so forth. So this presentation and the report that you've been provided really focuses on governmental constraints. And in fact, it's only a portion of the governmental constraints. This is, I want to emphasize, is still a work in progress, and we'll be coming back at our next meeting with some additional information about things like our fees and how our fees measure up against other cities, and any unique building code requirements and so forth. So it's a partial draft, but I think it covers the most important items. And a lot of these items are familiar to you. They're things you've been talking about for the last 2 years, mostly in the context of the San Pablo Avenue specific plan. But you talk about these issues at every meeting where you're being given a request for density bonus project or for a variance or for a parking exception, things that really relate to our development standards. So the Planning and Zoning Commission is a really important player in this discussion, because you are seeing firsthand where you're seeing a lot of requests for waivers, for concessions, where you see development standards that may just not seem to work. And so we're looking forward to any feedback that you can provide on these topics. So the first thing we have to evaluate as a potential constraint is our general plan. And the general plan is fairly new. It was adopted about 6 years ago, 2016, with a horizon year of 2035. So we're in the process of implementing that plan now. And that plan was an update to an earlier general plan that had been adopted in 1992 that looked ahead to the year 2010. The new general plan, I think, moved the plan kind of into the modern era of general plans, really focused more on sustainability, on walkability, on mixed-use development, on climate change, and things that really make Albany a more livable city. And it really carried that urban village by the bay theme, I think, to the next level. One of the embedded concepts in the plan is the transformation of San Pablo Avenue into a more walkable mixed-use boulevard with higher density housing, above ground floor commercial uses. That corridor in particular was really envisioned as the area where the city would see the greatest amount of change, and in particular, the most amount of housing. There's also a strong focus in the general plan on the conservation of the city's lower density and medium density neighborhoods, and a strong emphasis on connecting to the waterfront and looking at ways that Albany can kind of reclaim its identity as a waterfront city and bridge the gap created by the freeway. So an important point is that the forecasts in General Plan 2035 were aligned with the Plan Bay Area forecasts from that period of time, and they were much lower than what we're being asked to produce now through our housing element. In the General Plan 2015, we were looking at the 2035 plan, we were looking at a gain of about 775 households over a 20-year period, or 40 units a year. And that aligned pretty well with what our regional housing needs allocation, in other words, our housing element assignment was at the time, which was 335 units over 8 years. So the challenge now is that the state has asked us to plan for a much larger number of units. In fact, a number of units that we said we weren't going to reach until well after 2035. And this requires some rethinking of the general plan and some going back through and looking at are there places in the plan that impede us from getting to 1,100 units by 2031? These are some of the conclusions. I'll just go through them quickly. The density of 63 units per acre, which is permitted in many of the categories, is not really a constraint. We do have a fairly low density hillside designation on the west side of Albany Hill. On that Pierce Street parcel, we've talked about this before. Residential hillside on that parcel is only 6 units per acre. We also have land use categories that include height limits, and we'll talk about a little more about that after the presentation, and there are some subsequent slides. We're really treating height limits more as a zoning issue, but they are referenced in the general plan as well. A lot of emphasis on transitions and stepping down in density from the corridors to the neighborhoods. And so we're looking at those policies as well. And I think the commission is well aware that the San Pablo Avenue specific plan is moving in parallel with the housing element, and that there is a need for some strategic amendments to the general plan as part of that process. And I know we're going to be coming back to that. So moving on to zoning, we have the zoning districts you can see listed here on the screen. R1 is 12 units per acre. I will say from experience in other cities, that's a pretty high density for your lowest single family zoning district. You'll see in many cities that the single family zone is 6 units per acre, 7 units per acre. So we've already got a fairly good single family zone that allows, really it recognizes the fact that Albany has a lot of small lots, 2,500, 3,000, 3,500 square feet. And that is the density in many of those older neighborhoods. We also have the R2 district, and I won't go through all of these. I'll point out R4 is only mapped on one property in the entire city, and that's the Gateview Towers on Pierce Street, where that's the existing density. We also have the San Pablo corridor and the Solano corridor mixed-use zones, which also allow 63 units per acre. Housing is not permitted in the zones that are not listed here. So you've got the the CMX zone, which is more industrial in character, and in the open space zone and public facilities, really not intended to be residential at all in character. There's some general plan policies that support live work in the industrial areas, but we really can't count units or the potential for units in those areas with the zoning being as it is now. So I'm not going to go into detail on all of the zoning standards. I want to say this is a very simplified table. If you look in the zoning code, almost every one of the numbers that you see here has a footnote next to it, which gives you exceptions and certain conditions that also apply. But just on a very high level, broad brush level, you can see that each zone is subject to floor area ratio standards, minimum lot size, maximum lot width, lot coverage, building height, setbacks, and so forth. In looking through these standards, a couple of things maybe point out as come out as potential constraints. We have a floor area ratio standard in the R2 zone that's the same as the standard in the R1 zone for multifamily housing. So if you're building multifamily housing in R2, you're really subject to a single family FAR, which is a little bit odd. In R3, it's higher. We also have a 50% lot coverage standard in the R2 zone. The other thing I want to point out is that the R4 zone has a use permit requirement for pretty much anything you want to do there. It's not really too much of a constraint because that's a developed property with the towers. However, just as a formality, it would be good for the city to assign development standards to R4 and make housing a permitted use and not require a use permit for any change in that zone. It's kind of unusual that there would be that requirement. In the commercial zoning district, again, same caveat about lots and lots of footnotes in this in the municipal code with additional requirements. But you have, I mentioned the maximum density of 63. There's also a minimum density of 20 units per acre. You've got an FAR requirement for mixed-use development that's considerably lower on Solano Avenue than on San Pablo Avenue, and height limit that's somewhat lower, different various requirements for setbacks, and then ground floor use requirement. On Solano, you can do ground floor residential. That should actually say ground floor residential. Ground floor residential is allowed with a use permit on Solano, but not allowed on San Pablo unless it is not facing the street. So if it's in the back of the property, it's okay. That's for residential uses on the ground floor. Potential constraints here, we have a floor area ratio in the Solano Avenue district that's low for the 35 height limit. They don't really align that well. Typically with the small parcels that you would see that you see on Solano, you would expect a higher FAR allowance for mixed-use development. The 38-foot height limit on San Pablo, as we've seen before, makes it difficult to achieve 63 units per acre. It also makes it a little difficult to achieve that floor area ratio, and we have an illustration of that in just a minute. The ground floor commercial use restriction. I know it's an important priority to have those active uses on the ground floor, but it is in some form has to be acknowledged that it constrains the ability to reach those densities if there is a requirement that the ground floor has housing, or at least has housing in the front part of the building. So on San Pablo Avenue, when you put all of these factors together, the 38-foot height limit, plus the ground floor retail, plus the fact that we have shallow parcels that in many cases don't go through the block, we see development like what you're seeing on the slide, Portland Gardens and so forth, which is more like 30 to 50 units per acre, and very rarely 63 units per acre. Now, I should, in fairness, point out that these projects predate the current very generous density bonuses that we're seeing. So if they were proposed today, they would likely be taller than this. But at least historically, these standards have made it difficult to go to build anything near 63 units per acre along San Pablo Avenue. Solano, similar situation, but again, it's the 1.25 FAR. You've got small parcels, you've got narrow parcels, and a ground floor retail requirement. Granted, there's a way to get around that with a use permit, but for the most part, we're looking at FAR limits that give us two-story buildings and way less than 63 units per acre. So we're looking at how can those standards be amended to provide more incentive to build a little bit more on those corridors. The open space requirements, not really a terrible constraint. We've got 200 square feet of common open space required per unit, or 100 square feet of private open space, which would be balconies or patios. That is actually a very common standard. If you look at zoning codes around the Bay Area, you'll see that standard in lots and lots of codes. But what you also see is in priority development areas, in places where a city is making a commitment to build a lot more housing, that there's some flexibility around that standard and a little bit, in some cases, a lowered standard. And you do see that in the draft San Pablo Avenue specific plan proposal to lower that to 100 square feet per unit. The parking requirements, we've come a long way since the 2015 housing element. At that point in time, we were still requiring 2 spaces per unit, regardless of housing size. So you still had to provide 2 spaces for a studio. There was a process to reduce that, but it required discretionary review, and the passage of Measure N1 a few years ago has made it much easier to meet the standard. Well, it's reduced the standards and made this much less of a constraint. So you can see the new standards here on the screen. I want to point out that we don't have a parking requirement for accessory dwelling units. That's in part because of, well, not just in part, but it is because of state law, which really limits how much parking you can require for ADUs. They have to be more than a half mile away from transit and so forth. There's a bicycle parking space required for each unit, and the P&Z Commission has the discretion to reduce the parking standards further. I know there's been some discussion about eliminating parking minimums or adopting parking maximums. That's certainly something that can be considered. I'd say, maybe not as a housing element measure necessarily, but it's an ongoing conversation and discussion, and we're open to your input on that. Albany has a daylight plane requirement. This is a way of preserving light and air where a taller building abuts a lower building. You can see this illustrated here. There's 2 different ways to meet that requirement. This works really well in up to about 3 or 4 stories. What happens when you go up above 4 stories is that it becomes more difficult to do this kind of sloped plane, and this is why you're seeing a proposal as part of the specific plan to replace this with a step back. And I'm not going to go into detail on that. I think this is more just pointing out that this has not been a constraint in the past because you haven't really seen buildings over 3 stories. So once you go through that 3-story mark and start to get into the taller construction, it becomes more of a constraint. Okay, now to talk about what everybody, I think, has been bringing up at some of our last meetings, which is the wild card of the density bonus. And again, you're aware that the density bonus laws were significantly revised over the last 4 years. And because we have an inclusionary housing requirement, pretty much every project that meets that requirement with on-site units becomes eligible for a density bonus. And I think you saw that with that 1600 Solano Avenue proposal. Just 2 low-income units in an 8-unit project gets you a 50% density bonus, which is 4 more units. So that becomes a 12-unit project, but you still only have to provide the 2 low-income units. So those bonus units are market rate. This is state law. This is really not something we have a lot of control over, but it does have impacts on the height of buildings, because density bonus projects can request concessions and waivers from our development standards, including height waivers and parking waivers that are very common. And when you look at those development standards that I showed earlier, it becomes pretty clear that any density bonus project that adds 50% to the unit count is going to come back and ask for a height waiver and potentially a parking waiver and some of these other waivers. I know there's been some consideration of a local density bonus law, and that used to be more common. It's actually becoming less common because the state keeps giving things away and making it easier let me just say, it's very hard to compete with the state density bonus program through a local program. If you're a city like Emeryville, you can say, well, the state gives you 50%, we're going to give you 100% and let you build high-rise buildings. But that doesn't work in a lot of communities. And so I think we need to be careful in thinking about a local density bonus. Inclusionary housing, this is the requirement that 15% of all units and projects above a certain size be set aside for low and very low income households. The state of California actually considers that a potential constraint, because depending on what your percentage requirement is, it can reduce the profit margin and actually make it more difficult to build a housing development. For example, if you go up from 15% to 20% or 25% or higher than that, you may have developers that say we can't build the project because we can't afford to provide that many units at a below market rate. There also are some administrative challenges with managing and monitoring the below market rate units, the option of providing for an in lieu fee. Obviously, there's some controversy around not requiring the units to be on site, but there are also some benefits to letting those fees aggregate into an amount that can leverage 100% affordable development elsewhere in the city. So again, pros and cons to inclusionary, but we're required under state law to evaluate this as a potential constraint and make a determination if it is or isn't. I won't go into detail on the specific plan. You're having separate hearings on that and are talking about all of these things at length. I think I've said already that a lot of the standards in the specific plan are a direct response to some of the earlier slides, in particular, the height limits and the floor area ratio limits. The specific plan does propose to eliminate density, so you would no longer have a 63 unit per acre cap on San Pablo Avenue. If you were a developer using a density bonus, you would be basing that on the floor area ratio and adding 50% to the floor area that you could build if you were applying for a 50% bonus. So, something to be aware of. There would also be other changes related to commercial above the ground floor, different standards in some of the R3 district lots, and so forth. Coming to the end of the presentation, I just want to point out another state requirement is that we evaluate our standards for different housing types. And there are some very specific housing types that the state wants us to look at, and those include emergency shelters, which is the last line on this column. Right now, emergency shelter is only permitted in 2 of our zoning districts, the San Pablo Avenue Commercial and the CMX zone. It is a permitted use. It doesn't require a use permit, and that's state law. We could consider allowing emergency shelter in other zones, either as a permitted or conditionally permitted use. Single room occupancy hotels is another one that requires a use permit in the San Pablo Avenue commercial zone. Accessory dwelling units are allowed everywhere. So I'm putting this up mainly just to show that we have looked at our provisions for different housing types in different zones, and we can add to this. This is the state minimum that we're looking at here. So if whether the commission wants to look at tiny homes or other types of housing units that may be considered in the future, we can think about that as well. Just to close, additional constraints that are not covered in the portion of the report that was provided to you, our design review standards and guidelines, our building code and site improvement requirements, permit processing. Measure K is the measure that applies to the west side of Albany Hill, which limits the density on that Pierce Street property to 6 units per acre, or about 65 units for the entire site. Fees and utility connections. This is, how much does it cost to hook up a property to EBMUD or to get service from PG&E and so forth. And then our non-governmental constraints, which I mentioned earlier, which would also include things like community opposition to higher density housing. So I'm putting these discussion questions on the screen really just as food for thought and a way to, maybe structure the commission's comments. But we're really open to any feedback you have and to any feedback the community or the public has on the entire topic of constraints. But I think what we're most interested in is which standards in your experience as commissioners have been problematic in the different zoning districts, and then any specific feedback on parking, open space, inclusionary requirements, or the daylight plane. Then this whole question of the density bonus waivers and kind of ideas and thoughts about how to proceed given the potential for density bonuses, and any other constraints that you feel should be addressed through this process. This is an opportunity right now to think about things that, in your experience as commissioners, you've run up against and you think, gosh, we really need to change that law or that rule or that procedure. This is a great time to think about that. And I would say that to folks who are watching this meeting or listening as well. So that's the conclusion of the presentation. I can bring that slide with the questions back up as needed later on. And thanks again for considering these questions.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation, and we'll go to commission member questions first and then to public comment. So who would like to ask any questions of the consultant or staff?
I will.
Commissioner Waddy.
Thanks. Just a quick question, Barry. When we submit this to the state, do we have to propose solutions to governmental constraints or just articulate what we have identified as governmental constraints?
It's a great question, and thank you for asking. And yes, we have to provide solutions. Well, solutions might be too big a word. We have to provide a response to the constraints that we identify. So ideally, it's a solution. Ideally, if we say height is a constraint, we propose a zoning change that'll mitigate that. But, we may not solve every problem, and certainly there are some that are out of our control. But we have to have a response to the constraints.
Okay. I guess where I always struggle with this, at some level, all regulations are a constraint of sort. It just is a question of to what degree, and is it making housing infeasible? And if that's sort of the critical question of, over that line in that sand, I think that's different than just, is this some sort of general constraint that makes, things a little bit more expensive or a little bit harder.
Yeah, HCD, in their review of the housing element, they will tell us if they think there's something we need to address specifically. I mean, if we don't include an action, they'll say, you identified height as a constraint, you need to mitigate that. But they might not say that about another, like a setback constraint. I think they're focused on kind of the biggest ones.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Wadi. Commissioner Momin.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Miller, for the presentation. I have one question. I think you raised an important point about the state density bonus determined on the basis of FAR. Now that we have eliminated maximum limit on the density in the San Pablo Avenue area, the FAR will determine the density bonus, and we will need another method to calculate the density bonus. And you mentioned that other cities have been using that method. But they would basically work out the base scenario based on the permitted FAR, and then with the 50% bonus, they would get that bonus, which is kind of straightforward. But what I am not clear is how do they calculate the proportion of inclusionary housing units? Like it would be dependent on what kind of project program they have, what kind of unit sizes they include in the program, and what kind of unit mix they include in the program. So how it is determined in those cities?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I don't know that I have an answer for you. I know that you design the base project, and that includes an assumption about how many units are in the project. So when you're designing that base project, you're not just showing a box. You're basically saying this is the project with existing FAR, and we're proposing X number of units. So there is kind of still an implied density if you have a unit calculation. But I know the floor area bonus is based on the square footage of the habitable area in the building. So I know El Cerrito does it that way and they don't for their San Pablo corridor projects. I don't know if they have an inclusionary requirement in El Cerrito, but we could ask them and other cities how they're doing that, just to confirm. And Jeff, I don't know if you're aware of that as well, if there's a method you've seen.
I haven't looked at how other cities are doing. With respect to the other part of Commissioner Momin's question about kind of the unit mix, we do have some language in our municipal code section under inclusionary housing that the units that are designated to be inclusionary have to be representative of the mix, the overall mix of units in the project. So something to that effect.
Okay. Is there any language where we specify any requirement about some relation between the base project unit mix and the density bonus project unit mix? Because as we have seen on 1600 Solano Avenue, the base project included like small tiny units, 8 units, which were fitted in the permissible FAR. But then the density bonus project included large 2-bedroom units, and that kind of had a huge impact on the FAR.
Commissioner Momin, I believe that the city of Berkeley has both the FAR and the inclusionary, and they require the bonus units to have the same average square footage as the base units, as if I'm remembering that correctly. So yeah, I think that is the way we would structure it here as well.
Okay, yeah, it would be useful to do that. And then one more question. In your last slide, you listed those additional constraints, and in that you mentioned design guidelines. Now, in San Pablo Avenue specific plan, we have a lot of design guidelines. So how are you addressing that? Because it is not adopted yet. So in your draft, would you have any reference to that? And when the specific plan is adopted, and then would you update the constraint chapter?
We're not planning on updating the constraints chapter to add more about the San Pablo specific plan other than its status at the time the plan is adopted. So if it's been adopted, we would just make the appropriate edits. But I think we may want to include a program to monitor the San Pablo specific plan and see if any of those standards are creating problems and be prepared to modify them in the future if that's the case. It's a new plan. It's pretty different in the way it approaches development. And I think with any plan, when you introduce a new set of standards, you want to have a monitoring system and see how we're doing. And maybe that's part of the annual progress report on housing, but in some way we should be tracking how that plan is working.
Thank you. That's all.
Thank you, Commissioner Moman. And I would support staff doing some research into the how other cities are doing those calculations, as Commissioner Moman brought up. Commissioner Donaldson.
Yes. Thanks, Barry. A really good presentation, and the text that you've submitted to us, the constraints chapter, is really well written too. I really appreciate it. So keep up the good work. It's a very good presentation. I hope I can formulate my question, but I want to go back to the very first slide you had, and you listed like non-governmental constraints, and you were talking about those. And you're saying we're not really required by the state or by HCD to evaluate the non-governmental constraints, but looking at some of those, they might include construction costs. But one that I noticed was land cost. And I don't know, what does HCD do with different cities in different communities where Albany probably has a very high land cost compared to other communities. And I'm just wondering how, if they would even have any way of addressing that when they review the housing element. Is that a factor at all? And how could it be a factor? And I think it's probably a constraint. And I don't know what we could do about that, if anything, or how it should be in the housing element. I don't know. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a great question, and the same for construction costs, I would say, too. It's kind of getting back to Commissioner Waddy's question about, are we expected to mitigate all these constraints that we identify? And that would be an example of one where I think, we acknowledge it and point out that that's one of the reasons why housing is so expensive. The way, I don't think we would be mitigating a land cost constraint, but we might be compelled to then say, let's look at public land where the land cost is much lower or free, and reevaluate whether we have any opportunities on public land to build housing, or when we do have public land that becomes available for housing, that we commit to using that for very low income housing because we are mitigating land costs that way. So I think that's kind of the approach we take when we are looking at something like that.
Yeah. You don't have any guidance from HCD about on that topic, do you? Mm-hmm.
Not from them. It's really more looking at the housing elements that have been submitted from Southern California. They're a year ahead of us. And by the way, only 7 out of 196 of them have been certified, but that's a separate issue. Yeah.
Oh, jeez.
So yeah, HCD is being tough on this round, but yeah. In any case.
Okay. If I may, Chair, I have another question too. On the sort of decision tree slide you had, your last slide, and you wanted us to talk about, I think, some of the different zoning districts and all of that. It's a comment I have. I can do it later. I'll do it now. But I have a comment on the R1 district. And I'm thinking about 1978 Measure D had it. We've repealed the part of it that set the parking standards, if you recall, a couple of years ago. But I think what's still left in there is a requirement that in the land that was changed from R2 to R1, so most of the area, much of these portions of the area that would be west of Masonic, I think. In order to change the zoning in that area, you need to get the permission of all registered homeowners, something like that, within 300 feet. And I think that's still law. I don't think that when the city council put the ballot measure, I know it wasn't on the ballot measure that I voted for. It only eliminated the parking standard and allowed the city council to set the parking standard to a different level. But I think that's still is still there and still effective. I don't think it's been used. I don't know that we've made any zoning changes in that area and that portion of our R1 district. Or if we did, everyone forgot the law was there and didn't enforce it. I don't know about that. But anyway, I think that should be a housing constraint. I think that should be cleaned up at some point before as part of the housing element. So that was one thing I wanted to add. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Doug. That's a good point.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner Donaldson and Commissioner McLeod.
Yeah, good evening. Yeah, thanks again for the great presentation. Two questions. One about process and timing and the general plan amendment. Obviously, the San Pablo Avenue specific plan will require amendments to the general plan, and then so will whatever we do with the other zoning measures or zoning ideas or upgrades through the housing element. So is the idea that we combine all those or combine the two the sets of changes into one general plan amendment process? And then when is that going to happen? Because we can't obviously implement the specific plan until that's done. And so that is already going to be like moving into our next 8-year cycle, getting that approved. So how does all that work?
I think it depends on the specific changes that we're talking about, and the answer may be different for different components. Some of the zoning changes we identify in the housing element will likely not be made until after the housing element is adopted. And some of them may be made concurrently. And Jeff, you may want to chime in here too. I know that the specific plan is moving on a slightly faster timeline for adoption than the general plan.
Right, I can help with the sequencing that we have in mind at the moment. Our aspiration is to finish the specific plan and get it to City Council in the summer, and that would be a package of measures that would include the CEQA review, general plan amendments, and zoning ordinance amendments. So that would become effective 30 days after adoption by the council. The housing element, in the perfect world, we get approval we submit the draft this summer, we get good feedback from HCD, make the final changes, get it approved by City Council in late December, early January or something. Then we wait for HCD to complete their review and write the final letter that says, congratulations, you have a certified housing element. And then I think we would go off and start to work on things. If I remember correctly, in our previous element, we put some timeframes on ourselves, or maybe HCD required it. Barry would remember it better than I. Right. But some things need to be done in 1 year, some things in 3 years, and some things we just kind of give ourselves an implementation timeline that isn't mandated, but just is kind of a framework for us to work from. But I wouldn't try to package one big massive housing element plus a big massive series of zoning and general plan changes all in one night. I think that's just a lot for all of us to manage. I'd want to kind of spread it out over time if possible.
And Commissioner McLeod, one way I'm thinking of your question too is when the general plan amendments are made for the San Pablo Avenue specific plan, that may remove the need to make any further amendments that are related to the housing element. So depending on what is done through that process, we may not need to go back and do further amendments, for example, to the land use element, because those changes that we've pointed out here about the height limits will have been made through that process. I mean, we're all working together and making sure everyone's on the same page, but there will be a review of the general plan when the housing element is adopted, and we actually have to make some amendments to our safety element concurrently because it's state law to address things like evacuation and fire hazards when you adopt your new housing element. But we would not necessarily be undoing anything that had just been done through the San Pablo specific plan, maybe supplementing if needed. But I don't anticipate that we're going to really be making many more changes at that point.
Okay, yeah, so it would be like a separate, it would be separate. We would break it into different pieces. Okay, I was just trying to get a handle on sort of where we're going with that. Which kind of brings me to my next question, which is that we are addressing constraints on San Pablo Avenue. So then the next part of the equation for me is addressing constraints in the rest of the city, and we are mandated in a way to spread our housing growth around the city. So how are we going to identify what kind of gives us the most bang for our buck in terms of changes in the rest of the city? I guess sort of what areas would give us the most effective increase in housing and spreading it around the city? I guess that's kind of the big question. You know, obviously San Pablo is being dealt with, and then we would need to make changes on Solano, but that's not spreading housing all around the city as far as I would see it. So what do you think would be the most effective way to do that?
Again, the whole question of SB 9 and allowing 4 units on single family lots in a way makes that decision for us, because we're now looking at changes to our single family zoning that really allow multi-unit buildings and additional units in our single family neighborhoods. So then, you know, it's really a question of facilitating that and creating those opportunities. I mean, the state's creating those opportunities by default. So I don't know. I mean, one of the challenges we've seen is that Albany's lots are very small, and the opportunity for lot splits and for adding units is just more limited here than it is in so many of the other communities where there are larger lots where you can add a second home or a second dwelling unit or divide a unit. I think we had a statistic from one of our earlier meetings that 70% of the homes in Albany are 2 bedrooms or fewer. So the opportunities to divide a house is pretty limited. I think we're open to suggestions on that one as well. If you're in your experience as commissioners, you've seen obstacles to putting an additional unit on a single family lot.
Commissioner McLeod,
that's it for me. Yeah,
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I have some follow-ups to the last few questions. So in terms of the San Pablo Avenue specific plan, my recollection about CEQA hearings is that they can be, the CEQA can be take a while. There's hearings. There's having to put out the draft and get comments and then incorporate the comments. So given having to do CEQA on the plan, is the timeline really realistic that you've mentioned, staff?
I'd be happy to answer that question. Thank you. We're at this point in time for first the San Pablo specific plan and then ultimately for the housing element, we see that we can use the approved general plan CEQA document that was prepared in 2016 and using the addendum methodology allowed by CEQA, we can basically adopt an addendum to it. And that basically says the impacts that were originally identified and the mitigations that were originally identified are still adequate to cover the changes that are proposed in the new policies. And so an addendum doesn't require the types of public review drafts and so forth that a full-blown environmental impact report requires. So we were working with a consultant to prepare that, and we would bring that together with the approvals for the rest of the documents all simultaneously. And we see doing that for both the specific plan and then the housing element later in the year.
Okay. All right. Well, that explains that. Thank you. And then speaking of SB 9, I was thinking about that as we had the questions here. And SB 9 allows for a couple of things. It allows for lot splits, but it also allows for another home to be built on a existing single family lot. But my question is, does our current zoning preclude that? It seems like we would not have room on many lots in being able to accommodate the setbacks and having the entire lot have a certain FAR. So I guess how does that figure in? Once you put a second home on, do both homes you have to add up the FAR for both homes, and then it counts against the lot, or it counts against half the lot, or can you speak to that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you would definitely count that additional square footage as part of your lot coverage and floor area. So indeed, you're right. There would be a constraint to add an entirely new second dwelling unit, either to the rear or somewhere else on the property of an existing home on almost every lot in Albany, because you would be bumping up against that at least one of those limits. Even if you built a second story that was a separate dwelling unit, you probably could do it in a one-story house. But yeah, certainly the floor area and the FAR. The lot coverage and the FAR would be constraints to adding another dwelling. Mm-hmm. And what I'm trying to recall is if SB 9 includes provisions to override those standards. And I'm not remembering, Jeff, maybe you know that, but I don't recall if they do or not.
Yeah, I'm sorry that Christopher isn't with us this evening. He's been tasked with diving into the details of SB 9 and ADUs. And also, I think he's the person who's most in contact with people on a day-to-day basis and trying to work through the constraints that they encounter. I think if he were here, what he would say is the state ADU provisions are really very powerful. And when you really sit down and talk to people about what they want to do, the ADU regulations work for them. And they get that second unit or third unit, as small as 600 or 700 square feet maybe, but that's all they really want anyhow. It's accommodating an in-law or an adult child or just a tenant, whatever. And so everything is kind of going into the ADU pipeline.
Sure, but that speaks to what maybe individual homeowners currently want, but it doesn't really speak to housing production and how SB 9 might affect that. But so I'll have some comments on that when we come back around. I think if we could get more information about how SB 9 does or does not override existing zoning, that would be really important to understand how, whether or not people could ever use SB 9 in R1 in Albany at all. So thank you for that. And if there's no other questions from commissioners, anyone? Nope. Then we will go to public comment. And I see we have one hand up already. And anyone else who wishes to speak on this item, please put your hands up now. And Jeff, I guess you'll be letting people in.
Yeah, I'll take care of the clock. Jeremiah, please go ahead.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you. So last night, or the night before last, was a city council meeting. Special meeting was about the housing element. It was talking about the height bonuses and everything like that. So, the way I look at it is Albany can't really grow sideways anymore. The only way it can grow is up. So that's the only way we're going to be able to build. And, you know, Albany is still going to be here 200 years from now. And, you know, we're thinking short term, next 10, 20 years, 30 years. You know, what after that? 50 years, 100 years, 200 years. You know, so we're going to need to build these buildings pretty much as big as possible. You know, and when we talk about parking, we always talk about parking. And I think the term parking has kind of changed. It's electric parking, to park your electric car. So when I think of parking, I think of electric car parking, charging stations. So with this whole housing, the constraints on this, I mean, I look at a few things. Albany right now, I don't know. I don't know if we have any park residents. You know, let's say a resident at one of our parks. Let's say a 1-bedroom, 1-bathroom park residence on Albany Hill. You know, wouldn't that be nice? Or a park resident at the East Bay Park down at the Bulb, or a park residence at Memorial Park, or a park residence up at Terrace Park. You know, and those residences can be for staff, for city staff members. They can apply for it. You know, that could be at a reduced rate. They can only pay, you know, $400, $500 a month. And that could be low income or very low income housing. And that would make it to where either our staff members or our educators can afford to live in Albany. You know, we don't have a BART station yet, so we can't have housing at a BART station. So maybe one of the constraints is that we don't have any residential requirements in let me say this last word, in industrial areas. So residential and industrial zoning. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Next speaker, please.
Apologize for the beeping there. Next one, please. Okay, Clay Larson, please go ahead.
Hi, I just have two questions. The first is actually the same question I asked at the January meeting. That's the apparent discrepancy between the estimate of the number of units available on San Pablo Avenue, a discrepancy between the draft housing element and the draft specific plan. The draft housing element estimated 880 units. The draft specific plan estimated 1160, but they only counted 65% of the units. So the draft specific plan must have identified about 1,800 units. Mr. Miller, in response to my question in January, pointed out that the draft housing, draft housing element didn't count the 200 units at the bowling alley, but I don't think that covers it all. Then on pages 3 and 4, Mr. Miller notes that the general plan includes, and I'm using his words, neighborhood-focused policy designed to avoid dramatic changes in scale and character and the buffering of adjacent high and low-density uses along the San Pablo Avenue corridor. It's a very long sentence, Mr. Miller. He cites the policies on land use 2.8, land use 3.8, which specifically requires setbacks and daylight planes. Then on page 13, Mr. Miller notes that the specific plan proposes replacing the daylight plane requirement with a single step back above the third story. And then he adds the conclusion, the step back achieves the same goal as a daylight plane, but in a more cost-effective way. So my question to Mr. Miller is, I assume he's followed the specific plan process. Does he believe that this conclusion was based on any analysis by the city at all? Also, and kind of related, the specific plan consultant, Gene Eisenberg, has indicated that the amendments to the proposed general plan will be limited to the objective standards, the numbers, height, FAR. The consultant concluded that there was really no need to change any policy statements in the general plan because it was the general plan was deeply, I think, deeply rooted in the general plan's vision for San Pablo Avenue. So my question is, would Mr. Miller recommend modifying or eliminating, as he's characterized, things like the neighborhood-focused policies, or is he good with just changing the numbers in the general plan? Because you just had a discussion of possible constraints on R1. I would think I hadn't thought about this much, but I would think that the current 2 parking spaces per unit, which is so horrible, in R1 could be a constraint. So might add that to your list. All right, that's it. By the way, one more thing, Jeff, I think filling the screen up with a clock makes for very boring videography. So I like a better way. People are going to watch this. They could. All right, thanks.
Thank you. I know that it's difficult incorporating the clock in Zoom meetings, so I appreciate whatever we can do. So thank you for your comments. And next speaker, please.
Next speaker would be Ed Fields. Ed, please go ahead.
Hi, good evening. Ann Sue seems to manage to get the clock into a smaller box. It's rather annoying. I am confused, and I think we all need some clarity on what happens if we eliminate the maximum density standard, how the density bonus is applied. And Mr. Miller spoke to that. And if we use the FAR, then that means the FAR can't be increased by more than 50%. So a developer could not get a waiver. I mean, that's what I'm hearing. And then is the number of affordable units, is that again based on the so-called base project, or is it based on the 50% FAR bonus? Because we don't call it a density bonus. So what happens now? We have a maximum density standard, we have an FAR. If you want a 50% bonus in units, you can get that. Can you then ask for any FAR you want now? Or are you still limited to 50% now in the FAR while we have a density standard as well? So I think we need to understand this and how the affordable units are going to be allocated based on the base project or the bonus units. Clay covered one of my questions about the goal, the step back achieving the goal of the same amount of daylight and shadowing. That's what I would call the goal. Mr. Miller wrote that in R3 on page 9, taller heights in this particular zoning district could be inconsistent with the generally low scale of existing development. And that seems to be in a little bit of a contradiction to what we're doing in the specific plan, where those heights could be 50 feet and even higher if it's not R3, but Keynes Avenue or Adams Street is zoned SPC in a through lot configuration. I guess I'm going to go back just for a second to this density bonus question. How restrictive is the 1.25 FAR in Solano Avenue? Can that be exceeded by more than 50% while not exceeding the 63 units per acre in Solano? I hope I said Solano both times, the 1.25 in Solano. How much of a constraint is that? And how many years are we going to talk about mending the plan, the general plan and the zoning before we actually do it, if it is a constraint? I don't think I have time for several other questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we've taken all the public comment. Do you agree? Community development.
Yes, I don't see any other hands raised.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, so we'll bring it back for discussion to the commission, but I would like, if possible, the staff and or consultant to address some of the questions that came up. I'll try to summarize them as best as I can. There was a question which apparently was already answered in January about discrepancy between the units counted in the housing element and in the San Pablo Avenue specific plan. Did we already address that in January, or do you have anything to add to that, Mr. Miller?
No, we're continuing to address that. I think it's an iterative process, and we're making the same assumptions about development, but we've got to identify sites that are going to be available in the next 8 years. Realistically, so the numbers are going to be a little different in both plans. And Mr. Larson is right. We did count the bowling alley in one plan and not in the other. So there's discrepancies that are there, and the specific plan presumed some lower percentage across the entire corridor, whereas we're really looking at the individual sites and how many units we would expect to be on each one. But we're still working together to make sure we're consistent, and we're going to continue to do that so that the numbers are the same at the end of the day.
Okay, thank you for that. And then another question was about whether or not neighborhood-focused policies were consistent with some of the changes being made in conjunction with, I guess, the San Pablo Avenue specific plan and or the housing element. Would you care to address that, or does it make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it is primarily a matter of going through and making the numeric changes, as the speaker indicated. I don't know that any of the policies are going to be changed or not. I haven't had that conversation yet, but I would say most of the policies are still relevant. And, we're still saying that transitions and scale and height are important, and we still need to be mindful of those things. I did hear something about the R3 standards. I want to point out R3 is a district that's not just along the San Pablo Avenue corridor. So there are other places in Albany, down in the west side of the city near the freeway, along Pierce Street and along Brighton, where those policies are applicable there as well. So I think it's more than just Keynes and Adams that we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that. And then finally, Mr. Fields had some questions about density bonus versus FAR and 1.25 FAR in Solano. And is that a constraint? I apologize, and I don't mean to denigrate his comments at all, but I can't really summarize them very well. I didn't quite understand them. I wondered if you understood them better and wanted to address them at all.
Sure. And they're great questions. And I'm the first to say that the density bonus it's a really confusing set of standards, and the way it's calculated, I find that it's not that intuitive. How the bonus units and the base units and all that are counted. So I understand that it's confusing to me as well. With a switch to floor area ratio, what you would do is you would basically figure out the building that you could construct under the floor area ratio allowance. And then if you're doing a 50% bonus, you add 50% to that floor area. That doesn't mean that you can only increase the height by 50% or you can only modify the setbacks for 50%. You can request modifications to other standards to whatever degree you need to make that box that is 50% larger work. So you saw when that project on 1600 Solano came in, they were requesting an FAR that was something like 3.8. where the FAR was 1.25. That's way, way beyond 50%. So there's not really a connection between the types of waivers you can request and the magnitude of the density increase. There was another question I did want to respond to about the daylight plane and the step backs. And I think the point that I was trying to make is you see daylight plane regulations all the time in single family areas and in areas where there's 2- and 3-story commercial buildings as a way of protecting the light and the sun and light in residential backyards that are nearby. You don't really see it that often in areas where there are taller buildings and higher buildings. That's where you see step back requirements, and it's really, I think, just a practical matter that the way that building construction works is that you would step back a building at the third story rather than sort of this pyramid-like shape that you might otherwise get out of a daylight plane that would be difficult to build. So it's just a more practical solution that most cities are using, and it's really, I would say, more of a best practices issue than something that we specifically calculated just for uniquely to Albany in that case.
Okay, but thank you for addressing this. Appreciate it. Okay, so discussion. Why don't commissioners raise their hand if they'd like to throw something into the discussion? Who wants to go first? Anyone? Okay, Commissioner Moman is first. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Miller, once again for the great presentation. I generally agree with your assessment of constraints and support most of the mitigation measures that you have suggested. Before I go on my specific comments on specific measures, I would like to reiterate that I support most of them. I would just comment on the ones that I have some suggestions for. And before that, I have comment on the structure of your report. Like, you have done a great report, very descriptive, very detailed. But when we meet in the next for the next planning commission meeting, I would request preparing a kind of a comprehensive summary table of all governmental constraints, and then the summary table should include a specific constraint that are barrier to the housing production and conservation, the recommended measures to mitigate them, and the timeline and process to make those changes. And that would make it really easier for us to look at all the barriers in one go and discuss. Your report kind of is very detailed, and some of your recommendations are kind of hidden in the text. You have to really look very carefully to find some of your recommendations and mitigation measures. So I would really request if you do that, that would be really great. My first comment about some of your measures is about Solano corridor FAR change. I agree. 1.25 FAR is not really sufficient to accommodate the maximum density of 63 dwelling units per acre. We also have requirement for ground floor commercial, and so that really makes it difficult for developers to fit the maximum permitted density within that FAR. I also understand that general plan allows 2 FAR for mixed-use projects in the corridor, and so there is a disconnect between the planning code and the general plan provisions. However, I think if we consider increasing FAR for the whole corridor, I think we must look at, as we discussed earlier in this meeting, we must look at the density bonus scenarios for various parcel sizes and locations, and their impact on the character of the street and the parking demand. As we all know now that all projects could be potential density bonus projects. And so looking at rezoning FAR change through that perspective, I think is very important, because with the combination of higher FAR and density bonus, there is a higher possibility that we could get some really awkward projects on the corridor. As we know that Solano Avenue is not a wide regional corridor like San Pablo Avenue, and so I think we should treat it differently than what we have been suggesting for San Pablo Avenue. We want to encourage housing production, but we also want to maintain the character of this important street. So I think I would recommend undertaking a study before doubling the FAR for Solano corridor zone, and maybe in your policies and goals report, as you have mentioned somewhere, you could include an action item for this, which could be studied further, and then we could take some action on that. And then related to that, you have mentioned one constraint about open space requirement. We have reduced open space requirement for San Pablo Avenue corridor. And so I think it would not be a big issue reducing that for Solano Avenue corridor too. But as we now know that state density bonus kind of changes everything. And so we'll have to see what impact that would really make. And then the next point is about on page 19. This is about the in lieu fee. You laid out all the reasoning for pros and cons of in lieu fee. In this report, you are suggesting, you have mentioned that plan suggests greater flexibility for applicants in the way they meet the 15% inclusionary housing requirements, potentially making it easier to pay in lieu fees rather than providing affordable housing units. Other commissioners, may correct me if I'm wrong. We discussed this issue in our last meeting when we looked at the draft specific plan guidelines. There was this policy LU5 that talked about in lieu fee and also potential future study to determine the fee. And as far as I think, there was no consensus on meeting the inclusionary housing requirement flexible and making the in lieu fee easier. Considering that the city doesn't have city-owned vacant land, and also accumulating enough funds to make a project, feasible through in lieu fee might take a really long time. So I think some of the commissioners were of the opinion that city should prefer on-site inclusionary units rather than preferring in lieu fee. And so I think this language should be updated. We should not, I think, until we, undertake that study to work out the fee and also look at the pros and cons specific to the city's situation. We should not commit to making the in lieu fee more preferable to on-site inclusionary housing units. And then my last point is again about density bonus calculation methods. We discussed that earlier through the questions from me and as well as one of the public attendants. Now that we have this FAR replacing the maximum density on San Pablo Avenue area, we have now two methods applicable for density bonus calculation. One is based on FAR, and then for the rest of the city, we would have units per acre maximum density as the basis. When density bonus is based on maximum density, it gives us a clear idea about how many inclusionary units we will get irrespective of the unit sizes and unit mix, just based on the lot area and the maximum density permitted on that lot. But for the FAR method, we would not know that until a plan is submitted for the project. And we will have to rely on what the developers draws for that. And so as you mentioned, Berkeley has some standards, El Cerrito has some standards. I think we need more clarity on that, what the developers would include in their plans, what would be the unit sizes, what would be the unit mix, and what would be the number of inclusionary units city would get. And then based on that, FAR would be increased to 50% or whatever they would request. So I think we should undertake some study to look at this issue more thoroughly. We should look at ways to preclude any excessive bonuses that would result into bulkier buildings, and also not getting enough inclusionary units through this density bonus projects. I think that's all I have to suggest for today.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Moman. And Commissioner Donaldson, you are up next.
Unmute. Okay. Well, I have a few dog ears here of comment pages. On certain pages I want to comment. On page 2, I thought your point about the density on the parcel on the west side of Albany Hill was very well taken. And I really do hope the city, all of us together here, whatever, we can move forward on that in the near future. 6 units per acre density cap on that parcel may not be appropriate and really needs to be reviewed. So I was noted that. On page 3, you have a paragraph about Solano Avenue and the FAR of 1.25, and then the comment, and then the maximum FAR noted in the general plan was 2.0. My recollection is for sure that was a maximum density with density bonuses that were available at the time the general plan was prepared. I remember that. So very similar to what to the San Pablo Avenue language, which had an FAR, maximum FAR of 3 in the general plan for San Pablo, and 2 in the general plan for Solano. So that's my recollection about that historically. Let's see. When I read the report, I was a little bit confused about what you're proposing to do with the R4 district, where we don't have any zoning regulations right now. Or I thought we just had a use permit. Anything new there requires a use permit. I thought you were proposing to eliminate that language completely and just leave it blank, and that bothered me. So I think that if it'd be all right if we had, if we filled in the rest of the table with certain standards. We should have some regulations for the R4 district, because it's possible that someday in the future there may be some changes in land use at Gateview. Some proposals could come our way. We don't know, and we should have a way to address them. And you're probably right. Your point is well taken. That just saying a use permit's required isn't good enough. We need something better than that. So I agree with you there. Okay. Okay. I talked about the Measure D issue earlier. In the first paragraph on page 9, the last sentence, the code allows the Planning and Zoning Commission to approve single-family heights up to 35 feet where specific findings are made. I think that's in the R2 only, or in the R1H. And I wasn't sure of what the context was here, but not in the straight R1. So I thought that the sentence was confusing there, and should be clarified. That let's see what else do we have. On page 16, second line, there's a typo I just saw. You'll see it. Multi has too many letters in it. No, there's nothing there. What am I looking at here? Okay, that's good. That's probably it. I don't see any more tags. That's good. Yep.
Okay.
That's good. Thank you. Mhm.
All right.
Mhm.
Thank you, Commissioner Donaldson. And Commissioner McLeod or Waddy, did you want to make any comments?
Sure. Well, or Liz, if you want to go first, that's fine.
Oh, go ahead, Commissioner McLeod.
Oh, okay. Yeah, just to kind of keep moving on the same themes. I think, we're talking about constraints, and then, I guess my big concern is how are we going to spread housing around the city a little more? We've had a number of commenters over the course of our specific plan, say it's a matter of fairness, to provide growth around the whole city and not just concentrated on one avenue. So, I really would support increasing our zoning on Solano Avenue, for example. Definitely we could raise the height limit there and the FAR. And then one thing that I've noticed is that just about every application that comes to us for a new business on Solano requests a parking waiver, where if we actually did apply, strictly speaking, the parking requirements, we would not allow any new business to, inhabit any building on Solano. I mean, I think there are very, very few with parking lots, and the idea of requiring more parking there is, to me, kind of crazy. So I would also suggest that we extend our no parking minimum to Solano projects and raise the height limit. I think the advantage to raising height limits is that the base project, we get more affordable units out of our base project instead of just depending on state density bonus law for new height. You get fewer low-income units that way if we just depend on the state density bonus law. And I would say it again that state density bonus law may go away. I think there's a ballot initiative afoot that would eliminate that if it was passed, if it gets to the ballot. So I think we need to have standards that can stand alone and make sense for what we want to do without being overly preoccupied with what state density bonus law could do. Granted, I would not like to have an 8-story building on Solano Avenue, but the size of the lots and the, just kind of the building constraints, I think would preclude that in general anyway. But I could certainly see, at least 4 stories along Solano Avenue. Let's see, the other area that we could certainly upzone would be R3, the entire R3 zone, because, if we are concerned about transitions, and one way you make transitions is to step up to the highest area, which will be the San Pablo corridor. So we ought to be upzoning R3 around the city. I think that makes sense. At the moment, its height limit is the same as R2. It's basically, it looks identical to R2 in our zoning chart. So, I'm really confused as to what the difference is. I think we ought to be making a much bigger distinction between R2 and R3. And, and as a transition to the San Pablo corridor, it should be, its height limit should be raised and FAR should be raised. Let's see. So, back to Commissioner Momo's point too about open space. I think we could make it similar to San Pablo on Solano. And then, let's see, I guess one other maybe more contentious issue might be converting all R3 that's contiguous on the San Pablo blocks to San Pablo commercial as part of this transition, or just, I think that's that's actually a very, very big housing constraint, is having R3 on those contiguous blocks. I think it's probably one of the biggest constraints that faces San Pablo Avenue. So if those were all converted, and I know the pattern, the texture of some of those blocks is a lot different, but we're proposing upgrading one section of one block. I think it could be along the whole corridor, with the idea that there would be the possibility for more lot consolidation and more housing growth there. Measure K, I think, would be great to repeal. 6 units per acre on the west side is way too low. And I think we've had these discussions where it would be nice to consolidate the density at the bottom of the hill and preserve more open space on the top of the hill, and how that actually gets worded. I'm not sure, but preserving open space is part of the language of the current Measure K, but I think it's important that, we don't get one of those sort of low-rise, spread out housing developments that we saw a couple of years ago. And obviously, the sooner we could do that, the better, before we do get another project that could come and not be exactly what we want. So I would prioritize getting that language on the ballot, whatever council has to do. The last thing was, I agree with Doug on the regulations for R4. It seems like it would be smart to do that. I can't really think of anything else, but I think we should be sort of raising the whole city up a bit. And then R1 is almost like, it's almost just a misnomer now. It almost doesn't even make sense as an appellation, as a because there's really, if it's single family dwellings, that doesn't really exist anymore de facto because of ADUs, because of SB9. So I think maybe we have an R1 that is more representative of what's actually possible there because of state law, or mandated thereby, or allowed by state law. I don't know. So it seems like, there's some way to deal with R1 that we could rename it or reclassify it, or at least acknowledge that it is not R1. And I don't know how exactly we could modify it to include these other options that are shown in SB9. And then I guess, you brought up SROs, and I think that's a viable housing option. I would support some way to make it a little more possible for that to happen. It's great transitional housing, it's great entry-level housing. So, trying to include that in our mix on San Pablo Avenue would be fine. And let's see, anything else? Let's see, the in lieu fee, I'm a little leery of that. I understand the idea, but Albany's probably not going to generate a huge treasure chest if we did have it. One comment at the council meeting the other night was that, you start collecting it, but then it's almost immediately eroded away because of higher construction costs and other things over time. And then it does take a long time to put that to use to when you can accumulate it. So in general, I favor, more housing, inclusionary housing spread out around the city, and just keeping the inclusionary zoning ordinance that we have, and not encouraging in lieu fees or making the in lieu fees very high. Let's see, anything else? I think that's it, but I think we kind of want to raise the zoning across the city and spread it out a bit, and facilitate housing elsewhere besides just San Pablo. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner McLeod and Commissioner Waddy.
Sure. And before I jump into my comments, I did end up having one more question for Mr. Miller after hearing the conversation, and it's sort of a follow-up on my previous question. So at some level, if we can propose sort of a package where we demonstrate our ability to meet arena goals, and as part of that, we demonstrate sort of the governmental constraints that we will adjust such that we can accommodate our arena goals. Is that kind of where we can stop? Like I would imagine we don't have to just think infinitely about lifting all governmental constraints, just those to achieve our arena goals? Or is there not necessarily that direct corollary between the governmental constraints and our arena goals?
Yeah, it's a gray area, I would say. You know, in an ideal world, I think this is I'm glad we're doing it this way, but you would think, you know, it's better than having a state auditor come in and look at your zoning code and tell you everything you need to change. But in a way, that's what we're doing, is we're doing an audit. And so I think we're responsible to at least make the changes needed to meet the RENA goals. And anything we do beyond that is strongly encouraged, but not necessarily mandated unless we're violating a state law. For example, if we were not allowing emergency shelters anywhere in our city, we'd have to change our law to allow them. So those kinds of things. But once we've met our arena goals, I think it's really more, you know, we need to demonstrate a good faith effort that we're working to remove these constraints.
Got it. Okay. Because I was going to say, you know, my brain can keep going of like more and more and more constraints. And I feel like there is a point where we need to sort of put some pragmatic rails around it where, you know, kind of identifying where do we really want as, you know, a planning body, where do we want to plan for our growth? And, you know, is that really everywhere? I think is the question that's really being posed of us, or is it being focused in certain geographies, certain zoning districts and the like? So I do agree with many of the comments that my fellow commissioners said, but just to sort of hone in on the ones that I think are most critical is I would very much second the comments that Commissioner McLeod had regarding Solano Avenue in terms of removing the parking constraints for housing on Solano, because I do agree they're smaller sites. I don't think we're going to get site consolidation as much on Solano, but I do think it's a place where we could see some sort of moderate income, you know, a vertical addition on an existing building potentially where you get 2 units, or, you know, maybe a demo new construction of 1 small infill lot. And I think to an average person looking at redeveloping, trying to add parking on Solano would be a really pragmatic constraint, especially with the conflicts with the bus lines as well that are running on Solano. So I think that's, to me, a fairly easy solution. I think it's also parking on Solano is something we've discussed many times before in terms of, you know, it's a small scale commercial corridor and we really don't want garages interrupting our ground floor commercial spaces. And so, you know, if we want to keep the ground floor commercial spaces and facilitate the ability for people to add, especially sort of a lower density, you know, housing on Solano, there are probably a couple key sites where they could accommodate higher density. I think it is the place that makes sense to remove parking. Also, I mean, talk about the best place in Solano where people can get their services met, you know, through other modes of transportation. Solano is really it. So I would agree very much with that as removing that as a constraint, and would equally, you know, support you know, a bit more height on Solano. But my perspective is I really do feel like our focus should be on removing constraints and increasing density and development potential in San Pablo. And that being our primary focus. I don't need to reiterate. I think we've had, in my opinion, I've shared, sort of expressed all of my thoughts around the constraints to be removed through the Solano plan. So I'll sort of just park it there in terms of those comments, sort of copy and paste from the Solano San Pablo Avenue comments. And really my last comment, I think, is one where wherever we do still have remaining single family home only zoning, upzoning that to 2-family, I think is a worthwhile conversation to have. Effectively SB9, that's exactly what it's getting at. If we do upzone and get rid of single family home zoning, SB9 doesn't apply in Albany anymore. And so it's also a way to have some local control. And I think at some level, it's a little bit of the fire that's being lit by the state of increase your density capacity and you get to have your local controls back. And that would be a way for us to still be able to have some controls and some, ability to do design review, for example, on those projects where we can't through SB9, but we're allowing that increased density. So again, I'm not as well versed of exactly which parcels those fall into. I don't have the zoning map pulled up in front of me, but that would be certainly a constraint that I would be supportive of shifting. So anyhow, I think those are the three sort of buckets that I would really focus on. Otherwise, in terms of the non-zoning control governmental constraints, I think Albany actually does a really good job in terms of the speed within which projects move forward, much faster than I think most other jurisdictions. So I think we already have a pretty low bar on that being a governmental constraint in terms of holding costs and certainty of moving forward in the process, as well as the design process. I think we're pretty, our regulations are pretty clear and don't seem overly burdensome. I think we're pretty pragmatic, especially relative to a lot of other jurisdictions nearby. So I think on the other side of the house, outside of the zoning controls, I don't feel like there's a lot of change that we need to do and a lot of controls that we really need to. I don't think those are barriers to enter into new development projects. So that pretty much wraps my my comments and a lot of consensus with what my fellow commissioners also said. So thank you.
Thank you. And apologies for the ringing telephone in the background. It should stop in momentarily. Let me go ahead and give my comments. So the, oh gosh, that's annoying. 1 second. Sorry, one moment. Apologies. Okay. So let's see. I would like to support some of the comments that I heard from my fellow commissioners. The summary table from Commissioner Moman sounds like a great idea. And I think there's consensus on raising the FAR on Solano and in general making Solano more buildable, as people have been saying in a number of different ways. I think Commissioner Waddy just mentioned the parking as well. I support all that. Yeah, I think there also seems to be consensus on the in lieu fee that is likely not as applicable in Albany, given our lack of vacant land. And then Commissioner Moman always has some great comments that I almost understand. I think one of them is about using the density to calculate inclusionary housing, maybe instead of the FAR method, because we can get more inclusionary units or more certainty around those units using that method. I think that's what he's saying, but he can correct me in a moment if not, but that sounded like a good thing. And I want to support Commissioner McLeod's comments about, in general, the parking constraints on Solano again, upzoning other neighborhoods to R2 and R3 where appropriate, and maybe increasing the zoning on R2 and R3, or at least making, if R2 and R3 are very similar, well, then they probably should have more, they should be more distinct, and maybe we need to upzone R3. Let's see, I think he also mentioned raising the height. So to get more inclusionary units so that the state density bonus law isn't as tempting for developers. That sounds like a great idea. We get more, and we remain more, we maintain more control. And then I think your draft language does talk about reforming Measure K. Maybe it doesn't say that directly, but I think it does talk about more density. at the bottom of Albany Hill and leaving the top at open space. So if we need to make that language more explicit, I think there's also consensus about that. Then I want to address Commissioner Waddy's comment about, do we really want growth everywhere? Well, we do have the permanently furthering fair housing mandate now. So that does, to some extent, say we want growth everywhere. I think that is somewhat still open to interpretation since that's so new, but I think that does mean you don't just develop in one area of the city. I thought there was a great comment about removing the 2 parking spaces per in the R1 zone. That I think is a constraint to development. I also support the reform of Measure D. That sounds like the right thing to do. I don't think that came up in your language yet, but I think there's support on the council for that. And, in general, I think in general, I support all your ideas for where we need to have reform, removal of constraints and relaxing of codes where they are constraints. I didn't see any that I did not support, such as in higher FAR and the daylight plane also being a constraint, especially for the higher buildings. I agree with that. Let's see. One thing that I also want to support something that I saw in there, which is allowing 2 stories for ADUs. Other cities around us have gone that way, and I think we need to go that way as well. The 16 feet is a little bit confusing. I know there was one property owner who tried to build a 2-story, 16 feet dwelling as an ADU, and I think it ran afoul of our codes actually trying to do that. But in any case, if we raised it to 20 or 24 feet, it would be very clear that that's we're allowing 2 stories. And tiny homes, support those definitely, no question. Sorry, I'm trying to interpret my own notes here. Okay, I'll have to get back to that. But I did see something that was, and I want to support Commissioner Waddy's comment about looking into eliminating R1. And the city right next to us, Berkeley, is committed to studying that. I think we should commit to that as well. It's clear from the discussion in the beginning that we don't know if SB 9 will have any effect on us at all. And it might be very minimal because of our small lot sizes. So I don't think that will give us any growth in the R1 district, whereas doing our own revision of R1 would. And then as Commissioner Waddy pointed out, we'd have more control if we did. So I definitely support looking, we need a little bit more data as we discussed earlier, but I definitely support, little anecdote. I had my car serviced today at a place that I've never been before, and the owner happened to be someone who moved to Albany around 1970 and told me he bought his first home for $32,000 in Albany. And so look at where we are now. Prices are, 20 times that much in that many years. And so we obviously have it's supply and demand. We obviously have a huge demand. So if we leave R1 as it is, R1 is basically where the millionaires live. And if you look at a map of Albany, that's most of Albany. That's the vast majority of Albany. So not allowing multiple units in R1, I think would be a big mistake. And Yeah, I think, and so finally, I think you are maybe staff and or consultant. I think you are trying to walk a fine line here. I think we all want to preserve the character of Albany, and I think even with upzoning, we can. I think we will. I don't think any of this is going to destroy the character of Albany. Far from it. But I think you're paying a little bit too much attention in the language of the notion of preserving the character by making sure everything is small. These small houses. Well, even with the 2-bedroom houses that we have, these are $1 million houses. So I think you need to think about maybe relaxing your grip on that language a little bit, and embrace the fact that we will maintain the character, but we do need to grow. And I think that probably does it for me. And are there any follow-up comments from commissioners? Seeing shaking heads. So, and then did the staff or consultant have any questions for us about what we said, or did it all seem pretty clear?
It was very helpful feedback. Thank you all for your thoughts on these issues. It was very, very helpful.
Okay. I will say one more thing. It seemed like I think you got good feedback at the council Monday night. I listened in as well there, and so I think that's good. That'll help you with your work as well. So, all right. Well, let me go back then to the agenda, and I think that finishes up item 7.1. And item 8 is we do have one item of new business, a proclamation of appreciation for planning manager Ann Hirsch. And I was wondering if she was going to be here, or if she's just going to be honored in absentia.
I'm not sure if she's going to be here this evening. I did have a chance to share with her that it's on the agenda, and she was grateful for it. This is on the agenda at the suggestion of Commissioner Donaldson in particular at a meeting meeting or two ago. And I just want to say for the record how much I appreciated working with Ann, and I think the resolution captures the range of things that she did for us, and both in managing planning applications and keeping us current with our applicants. We don't carry a backlog of applications waiting for you for long, and that's because of the hard work that she did over the years, and kind of the behind the scenes setting up processes that make it go quickly as possible. And then some of the policy things and accomplishments that she's been able to do in her 10 years, and then the courage to take on some things that were very controversial and not easy, and she launched into those as well. And so for myself, just as my presentation to the commission, I wanted to be able to have a moment to articulate that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Commissioner Donaldson, for the suggestion. And I could read the proclamation if people thought that was appropriate, or just take any comments from commissioners and the attendees. Does the commission have any preference?
I don't know. I can move approval of it, but maybe you should read it.
Okay, I'm happy to read it, to give it a little bit more weight, so that everyone who might not have access to it also can hear it. So I'll go ahead and read it, and then we'll see if any public wants to make a comment, and then we'll see if any commissioners want to make a comment. So, in appreciation for Planning Manager Ann Hirsch. Whereas Ann Hirsch served the City of Albany Planning and Zoning Commission and the Community Development Department from August 2011 to November 2021, first as city planner and then as planning and building manager. And whereas during Ann's service to the City of Albany, she managed numerous planning initiatives, including preparation of a comprehensive update to the city's general plan completed in 2016, completion of 2 general plan housing elements and the initiation of the 2023 to 2035 housing element, oversight of more than a year of study sessions for the preparation of the San Pablo Avenue specific plan, oversight of the adoption of numerous amendments to the city's planning and zoning code, including accessory dwelling units, state density bonus law implementation, modernization of off-street parking requirements, cannabis business regulations, wireless antenna requirements, and chain store regulations. And in collaboration with her staff, oversaw the adoption in 2018 of the city's residential design guidelines, which received an award of merit from the California chapter of the American Planning Association, and examination of complex and controversial community development issues, including feasibility of a comprehensive on-street parking program, complete street study of Solano Avenue, and COVID-19 outdoor dining. And whereas during the course of the service to the city, and also managed the process of numerous planning applications, including bringing to resolution the highly controversial St. Mary's College High School use permit, rezoning, SB 35 planning application approval, disposition and development agreement approval of the upcoming city 62-unit affordable housing project at 755 Cleveland Avenue, which when completed will triple the number of affordable housing units in the city. Planning approval of the multi-family housing development at 540 San Pablo Avenue, which is the largest new housing development in the city since the early 1970s, and managing dozens of challenging and controversial home additions. And whereas during the course of service to the city and oversaw the day-to-day operations of the planning and building divisions of the community development department, including adeptly modifying the department's procedures and processes in the early weeks of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, therefore, the Planning and Zoning Commission expresses its appreciation for Planning Manager Ann Hirsch's extraordinary service to the Commission and to the City of Albany, and expresses best wishes in future endeavors. And as soon as we vote on this, this will be passed and adopted by the Planning and Zoning Commission of the City of Albany at its meeting of the 21st day of March 2022, signed by all of us commissioners. So now let's go to public comment, see if we have any comment on this item. Looks like we do have at least one hand raised, so please go ahead.
Jeremiah, please go ahead.
Thank you, everybody. Yeah, well, you got to give credit where credit's due. So, I definitely want to give Ann some props for, all of her hard work through the years. So, I would consider her an expert. I mean, look at all the achievements. That's incredible. This happens a lot. People do a good job and then they get something read during a meeting like this. And then it's kind of like, well, that was it. Well, I think Ann and many other people deserve a little even more credit. And I was wondering along with Ann if she could be the first or first among many, where maybe at our city hall or our community center, we could start a wall or a hallway or something to where we could put people's names up like Ann and a little plaque, and it'll say a few bullet points, like 38 unit residence on Cleveland Ave and, some accomplishments. So yeah, I just want to say great job, Ann, for everything, and hopefully your name could be put up on the wall somewhere in one of our city buildings. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your comments. And I don't see any other hands raised. Going once, twice. Okay, any comments from commissioners before we vote?
Say it's an excellent proclamation, Jeff. If you wrote that or whoever wrote that, very good, really thorough, and it's amazing to hear that list. So yeah, it's great. Yeah,
thank you.
I think I'll move approval if I haven't already. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. But we do have another hand up, so let's see if Commissioner McLeod wants to say something.
Yeah, I just really appreciated working with Ann. I think she was, as well, when I first joined the commission, and she was great, provided a lot of good guidance and helped me understand the position. And I have always appreciated her kind of steady managing of the projects. And looking at the proclamation, I'm really impressed by the body of work. And I just wanted to say it. Yeah, I first actually met her as an applicant bringing a project before the commission. In fact, I think it was my own house probably quite a while ago. And even, in that role, she was great as well, helping me shepherd my project through the process. So I've appreciated her on both sides of the whatever you call it, both sides of the aisle or whatever, but yeah, and I just want to wish her the best in her future endeavors. So.
Thank you. And do you want to second Commissioner Donaldson's moving of the
second,
item?
Yeah, second,
Okay.
That's fine.
Very good. And any further comment before we go to the vote? If seeing none, Commissioner McLeod?
Yes.
Commissioner Waddy?
Yes.
Commissioner Moman?
Yes.
And Commissioner Donaldson? I think that's a yes. You're muted, but I'll record that as a yes. And
Yes.
yes, thank you. And a yes from me as well. And that passes unanimously. And thank you once again, Commissioner Donaldson, for the suggestion, and staff for executing that proclamation. Great. And that takes care of new business. Next meeting, item 9 is April 13th in the City Council Hall chambers or virtual meeting. So maybe we'll have a hybrid meeting set up. Do we know, or?
Probably not.
Okay.
We would need to make sure that everything works perfectly tomorrow, and
okay.
I'm not sure that we're there yet. So we'll probably, but we're working towards a hybrid format in the near future.
Great. All right, thank you for that. And last item on the agenda is adjournment. So thank you all for your service tonight, and we are adjourned.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.